Mikki Brock, Associate Professor of History at Washington and Lee University, and Dr. Chris Langley, Reader in Early Modern History at Newman University. And their talk will introduce us to the website Mapping the Scottish Reformation, which allows you to explore the lives and careers of the Scottish clergy between 1560 and 1689. Through the use of interactive maps, this is the first project to comprehensively chart the growth, movement, and networks of Scottish ministers, and is based on over 10,000 pages of manuscripts held at the National Records of Scotland. So it's over to you, Mikki and Chris. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, Jessica. And thank you to everyone for joining us, what with the amazing weather that y'all are having and all of the other things that are going on your side of the pond, which shall remain nameless. So we appreciate that you are here to hear Chris and I chat a little bit about a project that is so important to us. Chris, do you want to say anything by way of intro?
Yes, so thank you everyone for coming, and hopefully in the next half an hour, 40 minutes, we can talk about the Scottish Reformation. We can talk about how we use technology to make the Reformation more accessible, and also how we can use this platform, I suppose, to think about Scotland's records and accessing them.
Great. So Joss, if you want to go to the next slide. So as you might imagine from the title of the talk, and some of you have heard us speak about this project before, our subject is the early modern Scottish clergy. And you see a number of different images here sort of representing, I wouldn't say the diverse group of Scottish clergy that we are grappling with, but nonetheless different images to give you a sense of who we are dealing with. And these ministers that are at the core of mapping the Scottish Reformation, they comprised a vast and really quite varied groups in terms of their careers. And surprisingly, the clergy have been understudied at the sort of collective level. And the reason I say surprising is just because they were so prominent and preeminent in post-Reformation Scotland. It's been remarked that you couldn't, go anywhere in post-Reformation Scotland without you could swing a cat and hit a minister anywhere you went. And what's interesting to Chris and I about these ministers and thinking about their careers is that there's not one solid blueprint for what a clerical career might look like. Instead, different ministers took very different paths. Some were quite mobile, moved all over the country. Others stayed in one place for the entirety of their career. Some were good clerical citizens and sort of never really got into trouble and were sort of loved and even deified by their parishioners. But other ministers courted scandal wherever they went. Imagine that. And here I'm talking about things like fornication, drunkenness, inappropriate partying, even witchcraft. And what we want to do with our project is sort of tell the story of these ministers as individuals and as a group, to tease out the forest and the trees of these clerical careers through our project. And one thing to sort of note is that though we are looking at the Scottish clergy, who, were really critical to religious, political, social life in this period, they oversaw religious and political change, they communicated the word of God, they disciplined their parishioners, they oversaw poor relief, and on and on. We're not only interested in these men, we are also trying to grapple with the importance of their wives and the influence that those women had in this period, as well as clerical families and networks. So I just give you that sort of overview by way of saying that if you want to understand this period in Scottish history from the Reformation 1560 through the revolution of 1688 and 89, you have to grapple with the Scottish clergy. And what we are trying to do is build a tool that will empower researchers to do just that. Okay.
Wonderful. So, Joss, can we have the next slide, please? Thank you. So, Mikki's given you an idea of the ubiquity of the cleric in early modern Scotland and the kind of connections their families could have in parishes across the country over this period, 1560 to 1689. I guess the question that we need to answer is, why do we need these kind of large-scale tools to understand the Scottish clergy and to be able to track them? Well, the first thing we do is always think about the kind of finding aids that we have as historians, whether you're doing academic research, family history, genealogy, or any other projects that actually track these people. And I suppose before we came along, there were two ways of finding information about clerics in this period in Scottish history. The first is to do the shortcut that everybody does, which is to use this 12-volume work on the left-hand side, and it's Hugh Scott's Fasti Ecclesiae Scotica. And so many of you would have used this sort of text before, but Scott's text offers small snippets of biographical info for ministers across Scotland, right from the Reformation in 1560, right up to Hugh Scott's own day in the early 20th century. Now, Scott's work is incredible in many ways. This is his life's work. And there's a huge kind of compilation and tapestry of sources behind Scott's work. For us, though, in the 21st century, there are some issues about using Scott's work. So, for example, you can see the scan on the left-hand side of the slide here. This is about as digital as Scott's Fasti gets. So if you go on Google Books or Internet Archive, you can see the digitized versions of these books. If you go into NRS, you can see them all near the Reading Room, National Library of Scotland as well. The issue is that you can't fundamentally search these documents. There have been indexes created of them in some cases, but nevertheless, they are very difficult to actually use. The other thing that you might notice from the image on the slide for Muir of Onside in Presbyterian in Lisco is that there is incredible variation in the length and depth of the bios that are given by Hugh Scott. And this kind of can be applied as well to the different parts of Scotland too. So Scott was very comfortable talking about certain lowland parishes, but certainly less comfortable talking about other parts of the country. And you can see that if you've ever gone through different volumes of the Fasti for different regions of Scotland, that the level of detail can be frustratingly low just when you need it to be more kind of fundamental. And I guess finally, just to add to those two issues, and Mikki and I have been described in the past as manuscript junkies, and you'll find out about that more in a moment. But Scott's Fasti is remarkably difficult in terms of following the references. So there's a lack of consistency in how Scott referenced his quite incredible material. Sometimes he was getting this from word of mouth. And of course, the further back in time you go, the weaker the source base becomes. And if you've ever tried to track any of the info, the little tidbits out of Scott's Fasti, you will know this kind of issue. So that's the first place to go, or we would traditionally go as historians to look for info on the clergy after the Reformation. The second place to go is documents like the one you see on the right-hand side of the page here. So this is a record from Linlithgow Presbytery. It includes information about the ministers of Muir of Onside. Unfortunately, this is a rarefied skill to be able to read this work. Many of you watching will be able to. But just passing through this sort of information is incredibly time-consuming. So Mikki and I go through these records all the time, and it takes like a fine-tooth comb to be able to find the bit of information that you need. Now, it might be that the extraneous info on this page is fabulously interesting and distracting, but it's really difficult to search kind of fundamentally. And that's even the case taking into account the virtual volume service that NRS are offering and have been offering for the last couple of years to access this stuff online. You can get all this stuff, but actually finding what you want is very difficult. So we needed to think about ways, we use this on a daily basis, one of these methods, and we needed to think about a way that we could provide a platform for ourselves and other researchers to be able to find information about clerics, their families, their backgrounds, their educations in a much easier to use way, thereby saving scholars time in the future, but also offering this one-stop for all of this information so scholars can get on with the work that they want to do. They don't want to be trawling around these books just to find that one little bit of key information. So these are the two main sources of info on the clergy, and there are challenges in accessing these and using these that we felt we needed to sort of confront and think about while we made a tool to navigate this world. Mikki, I'm going to hand it over to you for the next slide.
Yeah, great. So Chris has told you a little bit about the sort of why of this project, that is to say, the challenges and hurdles that researchers have when trying to grapple with the two sources we have at our disposal for finding information about the clergy. And so what I want to do is just share a little bit about what mapping the Scottish Reformation is and what this tool that Chris and I have been working on for a couple of years actually does. The sort of obvious thing that we've already hinted at is that our project is really intended to be sort of an easy to use method to track clerical careers. And we're really, one of the reasons we're really excited about talks like this, talking with people who are really engaged in this work from different vantage points, is it gives us a sense of how do we build a resource that other people need? Because that is what we are trying to do, is not create some sort of finished product, but rather to build something that can serve as sort of an infrastructure for the field. Right now we are focusing on one region of Scotland. We'll say more about that in just a bit, but we hope to expand this to the entirety of Scotland in a way that will provide, I think, sort of crucial framing for asking questions about social, religious, political life in early modern Scotland moving forward. And in thinking about building this sort of online database and mapping tool, we've really had in mind a range of different groups that would be keen to use this sort of resource. So we are not just building something for academics, although of course Chris and I are both in that world, and we think a lot about crafting a website that our students can use, that we can use, that when we're working on our own material, we can say, hey, I wonder what this minister is getting up to, and just pop his name in there and find information. But we are also really keen to make sure that what we are designing is of use to genealogists and family historians. The reason we think that is really important is all of y'all here probably will know this, but ministers and their families and their wives left sort of outsized archival footprints because of the sort of volume and quality of the CH2 records, that is the church court records held at NRS. We can find really interesting things about these guys and details that we can't always find about people in the 16th and 17th century. So it really is crucial to be able to wrap our hands around this group. So we've built what I think we're calling it it's like a beta 2. I can't remember even what the name we've given to the pilot website we have right now is, but we have a very pilot sort of beta website. So that's just to say early stages of the website that provides in some ways a template for what we are trying to do moving forward. And right now, what we have, the maps.mappingthescottishreformation.org website has a couple of different tools in place that can allow its users to explore what we think are really exciting parts of clerical careers. And if you go to the website, you'll see pages along these tabs that look like what you're seeing on the screen. We have one sort of page or view that allows any user to trace the tenure of a minister. So that is to say, if you pick a minister, where were they? How long were they there? That is actually really quite interesting to me, the tenures piece, because we may want to ask the question, what's the average tenure for a minister? Is there regional variation? Can lengths of stay in given parishes give us a window into periods of upheaval? What can we learn about society writ large if we know how often people are moving? Because of course, a parish losing its minister is disruptive, even for the sort of everyone in the pews, right? That piece is really crucial. We have a view that shows journeys. So actually we can think about precisely where the ministers moved. Were there patterns of people going from highlands to lowlands, east to west? Did people stay within one region, or do they travel quite broadly? And does that shift over time. That's another thing that we are quite interested in. I should say at one point in building this pilot website, Chris and I had all of these very fancy ideas for how to show the journeys, like with an illustration of a little minister moving across the country. I probably wanted something silly like that. Chris was really thinking about, can we figure out exactly how far they traveled? That's really interesting. Our website team at the University of Edinburgh called this the I Want a Pony stage of our website building, where we came up with wildly undoable things. But anyhow, the Journeys tab is quite exciting. We have a page on education. And that is where you can see, for example, where ministers who were educated at the University of Edinburgh went on and took up their first post. And that, I think, will be really interesting in thinking about the influence of universities across the country. And of course, we have a page on spouses, which I should say is quite piecemeal populated now, but we're planning to expand that. Chris will talk about that, I think, later on in the presentation. The whole goal of this Mapping the Scottish Reformation site really is to take the manuscript data that we are so excited about and translate it into these different sort of page views and tools, to include quantitative search tools where you can say, hey, what's the average tenure of ministers in X parish between these years? One of the things that the website does is has these sort of bespoke searches that one can make. And the last thing I'll say before passing this on is we've really tried to design a site, and we'll be continuing with this idea moving forward, to design a site that is built with open linkable data. That is to say, design our website in a way that is interoperable with other projects. One of the things that's really wonderful about the digital humanities community is the desire to share ideas, but also to share points of data and to make sort of projects link up nicely with one another. And we have been invested in that from the start, and in creating something that doesn't have a paywall, but is useful for everyone. So I'll turn it over to Chris.
Yeah, brilliant. So just if we can have the next slide, please. Wonderful. So Mikki's given you an introduction to what we were doing with the website, and I want to kind of highlight a few kind of core findings, or like just the headlines, I guess, before we dive into some case studies, really. So you heard in the introduction from Jess right at the start that we've gone through just over 10,000 pages of manuscript. I think it might be about 13,500 at this point. And by doing this, we've extracted about 6,000 or so data points in around 22, 23 categories that all relate to clerical careers. And on top of that, we've also referenced every single data point to where it's come from in the manuscript, or in some cases in some printed resources that we've used there to augment that stuff as well. And as Mikki said, our initial website, we were calling it version 1.1, but internally we called it 3, which is slightly confusing. We are focusing on this area of Lothian and Tweedale here. So this is a really significant part of Scotland in this period. It includes an awful lot of variation in terms of the types of parish that you're thinking about, from the intramural parishes of Edinburgh to the coastal parishes of Queensferry and the East Lothian coast, right through to the much more rural parishes in towards Peebles. So this is an incredibly diverse area, but we wanted to test a number of our kind of data collecting principles on an area that was so varied, but also so beautifully documented, so we could get a really nice data set going. So out of this 10,000 pages of manuscripts, 6,500 data points, we tracked the careers of 654 ministers between 1560 and 1689. That's for this area in Scotland, Lothian and Tweedale. And also the details of family members relating to those 654 ministers. And in that, we covered 120 parishes across 7 different presbyteries that were carving up that region in the early modern period. And this is particularly interesting when places like Peebles Presbytery kind of emerge in this period in the 1640s as well. So we're trying to trace some of those changes. And as you can see on the screen grab on the left-hand side of the slide, it's not just the kind of visualizations that we're interested in, although as Mikki said, we kind of obsessed about that in some ways, right down to the kind of palette that we use to make sure it's accessible for a whole wide range of different sorts of users and their needs. But it was really important to us that we established kind of a toolbox of search filters for our users that would allow them to build the kind of queries that they were interested in, rather than us kind of forcing upon them a number of our own assumptions. And this took a great deal of time to try to work out not just how they're technically feasible, but also if you can build a wide range or a wide enough range of ideas with these tools. So you can see on the screen grab on the slide, just on the right-hand pane of that screenshot, you can see the search filter tab, which you can move to the side and just focus on your results if you want. But this is kind of where the power of MSR comes in, or back in the Scottish Reformation, where we allow users to, in this case, search for the education of ministers, where they were studying, when they graduated, when they were appointed to their first parish. And even, as you can see at the bottom of that tab there, we include live quantitative analysis as well of that data. So as you change those filters, those numbers at the bottom of the screen change for you just on the fly as you go along. And from this search, you can see on the screen here, between 1560 and our last minister's appointment in 1737, so quite late, there are a certain number of clerics coming from these 3 universities, St Andrews, Glasgow and Edinburgh, all very specifically colour-coded as well for accessibility. And you can see how we're thinking about the distance they travelled between where they studied and where they were first appointed, how many graduates in a certain year were appointed in a certain year, so we can quantify that as well, and the average year between somebody graduating from university and their first appointment, just so we can start to model what kind of an average career looks like for a minister. And there are some great comparisons you can make with modern day ministry in this sense as well. And so all of this is very kind of broad, but you can also, as we'll show you, zoom in on very particular results. And I mean literally zoom in. One of the most demanded features we had after our first test was that little zoom in and out button on the left-hand side there, at the bottom of the page. And you can actually identify and zoom in on the journey, the career, the education and the life of just one minister. And so this is particularly important for the genealogical community if you're tracing a particular person or family, and you want to sort of add those details that would be so difficult to try and find from all of that source material that we just mentioned to you, whereas here it's all aggregated for the user. So 12,000 pages of manuscript, 6,000 data points, almost just over 650 ministers and their families, all arranged across these 5 different map views, looking at the tenure of a minister, the journey in their career, where they were educated and their initial career movements, their families, and also key and significant events in their careers, all accompanied by these kind of search tools that you can see right in the middle of the slide. I think we're good for the next slide, Mikki.
So one of the things that Chris and I really wanted to do with this presentation is give you a more detailed sense of the types of questions that have animated the way that we're thinking about this, but also a window into how you or your students or just anyone, I don't know, I'm imagining some random person off the streets who wants to use our project, but ways in which it can be used and the types of details that we can extract from the search tools that Chris was just describing. One of the things that has been really exciting to Chris and I from the outset is the extent to which this project allows us to view both regional and chronological patterns. In some ways, you can think about it in this way, to use potentially a tortured metaphor, is the project as a whole shows us sort of the forest of the ministry, but we can zoom in on individual groves, we can zoom in on trees, or even the leaves. And anybody who has sort of really grappled with Scottish history in this period knows that there are all of these assumptions about different regions of Scotland at various points in the 16th and 17th century. A lot of these assumptions actually coalesce around what historians think about as the covenanting revolution of the mid-17th century. And one of the things that we are hoping our project can do is test whether or not those assumptions hold as much water as they are often given in the current historiography, what's been written about them thus far. And just the most blatant, obvious example of this is there is this idea that the southwestern part of Scotland was fundamentally more radical in its nature, and that there was an inherent instability at times that came with that radicalism, that they embraced rebellion and rejections of the mandates of the monarchs in a way that constantly caused them to rub up against challenges and problems. There's also a fundamental idea that the Southwest was constantly plagued by divisions within the ministry there itself. And we want to test that, right? Does that bear fruit? Does the Southwest have any more chaos or turmoil than anywhere else in this period? And as we expand our project, we'll be able to ask and answer questions like that. The same will hold true for this idea that the Northeast was fundamentally more conservative in the 17th century in its attitude towards covenanting and willingness to go along with episcopacy than other parts of the country. And looking at these key moments that Chris mentioned earlier, in a cleric's careers, were they suspended, were they deposed, what other sorts of scandals plagued their lives, that will give us a window into the truth or not of those traditional ideas that we have about regional patterns. And that's just one example. In thinking about chronological patterns, I've already mentioned that one of the things that's been interesting to me from the outset is this question of clerical tenures. And looking at the Synod of Lothian and Tweeddale, we know that the average tenure of a minister in a given parish there was, for the whole period of our project, from 1560 to 1689, right about 12 years. But we also know actually that average tenure was quite a lot shorter, closer to 7 years for the first few decades after the Reformation, meaning that it took quite a long time to work out staffing in the years following the break from the Catholic Church. We also know that there are, in our region, 9 ministers whose careers lasted more than 50 years in one parish. Imagine the influence that a minister would have had on that parish if he was in that position for 50 full years. That's really remarkable. But what we also know is that all of these long-serving men who had that 50-year span in their post, all of them had been appointed prior to 1620, meaning that they had their position before all of the upheaval of the Covenanting Revolution, which gave them some degree of stability. And so those are just broad examples of the types of regional and chronological patterns that Chris and I really feel like Mapping the Scottish Reformation has the ability to uncover. And I think Chris is going to say a bit more about the Covenanting Revolution in the Synod of Lothian and Tweeddale in particular.
Yeah, so as you can see on this slide, we wanted to give you an example of that kind of wood for the trees, trees for the leaves, that sort of thing, and to try and think about these kind of layers of detail that we can achieve. So one of these assumptions that Mikki was talking about was about ministers during the period of the National Covenant, that initial kind of fervour, kind of culminating in 1638 and the apparent throwing of stools in St Giles and that sort of thing. So I would say it's apparent that Jenny Geddes was involved. There was definitely throwing of stools. And then kind of culminating again in the General Assembly at the end of 1638 and into 1639 is this idea of ministers being deposed for kind of standing out against the covenant and for being ill-affected, to use the language of the time. And we can use Mapping the Scottish Reformation and the Events tab in particular, and you can see the URL on the screen there if you would like to visit it, to actually zoom in on particular things that were happening at that moment. So all I've done here on this screen grab is set the chronology, the period to 1637 to 1640, that kind of huge moment of change in Scottish history, straddling the start of the Covenanting Revolution, and identify I want to see ministers who were either deposed or suspended in between 1637 and 1640. In other words, ministers who held out against the covenant in some way at the start of the revolution. And you can see from the map, especially from the aggregation on the bottom right, that there are 13 individuals in this region of Lothian and Tweeddale who were suspended or deposed during these years. And what's wonderful is you can really get into the regional variation of this. So by using those presbytery tick boxes on the search filter panel on the right-hand side, you can identify which presbyteries were the hotbeds for this kind of anti-covenanting movement. And when you do this, if you untick each of those boxes and you end up with Presbytery of Edinburgh, you find that 10 of those 13 ministers who were suspended or deposed resided in Edinburgh, the Presbytery of Edinburgh, and most of them resided within the walls of Edinburgh itself, within that part of this kind of large area that we're looking at. And also those aggregations that we were talking about, like, you know, you can use this kind of big data, I suppose, or biggish data. You can see that 1639 is easily the most eventful year for depositions in this 1637 to 40 period, with 10 of those 13 depositions and suspensions taking place in 1639. Now, these seem kind of interesting, but academic, I suppose. The key behind this, and so many of the other kind of stories that we could tell you about this data, is that you've got this regional perspective. You can look at the impact of these key historical events, these moments in time, on the kind of lives of these individuals. But what's key here is that to do this manually through manuscripts and through the printed resources at the time would take you a significant amount of time. Mikki and I have both done it manually, and there have been, and I don't mean any disrespect to either of us here, there have been better scholars who've done it over the last 50 years as well, and it's taken them huge amounts of time. And of course, this all became much more pronounced during the pandemic, when we kind of started like opening up our website to users. So this allows us to get this regional view, which is fueled by incredible amounts of material that would hitherto take, I would say, years to access, to understand, and then to be able to kind of compartmentalize in a way to get this kind of image. And you can do it all with a couple of clicks. And I have to say as well that we didn't design it with this question in mind. It just happened that I was writing something on this the other week, and I did this screen grab after this very quick search. So this is kind of reactive and responsive to research needs that you might have, and then you can come up with these really powerful kind of broad insights using this data. So that's the first case study we wanted to show you, but if we can just move on to the next slide, we can dive even deeper into this local perspective. Mikki?
Yeah, and I'll go kind of quickly through this so that we have enough time to talk about what we're doing next with the project, because I think that's in some ways both exciting and also necessary and slightly terrifying for Chris and I to chat about. And that's in some ways what we want a lot of feedback about. But let me just give you a sense of the sort of local detail that we can tease out as well. And by local, I mean, what can we learn about a given minister's career, where he began his post and where he subsequently moved? What happened to him over the course of his life as a minister in the Church of Scotland? So Chris has sort of screen grabbed here this career of David Ogle. And you can, for example, if you are doing family research and you know you have the name of minister and you want to find out precisely where they began their career, the first place that they were appointed, and then where they went from there, our website allows you to do that. So you don't even have to do anything beyond just entering the name of the minister to find out this sort of detail. And one of the things that's really exciting about the Journeys page is you can click on a given minister. And again, here, David Ogle is the example, and find out where he began his work. And then where he moved later on over the course of that career. What I also think is tremendously exciting in particular about that is all of the fun and exciting detail about clerical lives that we haven't been able to sort of
turn into this sort of quantitative data. Because we include manuscript references in all of our data points where we have them available, means that then you can go to Scotland's People, or you can go to the archives and actually look at the manuscript itself if you want to sort of flesh out the details surrounding that minister's career. If you want to know more about why David Ogle, for example, was suspended, right? If you want to know what sort of trouble was he an adulterer? Did he fornicate? Did he get in political trouble? What was going on? Why did he end his career? Was he ill? What was happening there? And you can see hinted at some of those points of information here in the screen grabs. You can find that going back to the manuscripts themselves. And I think that has been really important to Chris and I across the board. Again, this is not meant to replace engagement with those church court records, which are so important for our field. It's meant to facilitate using them in a way that's more effective in terms of time. I think Chris will probably say a bit more about the sort of granular detail here that's in this screen grab, but I also wanted to say that as well, we really don't only want to give detail on the lives of the clergy themselves, but on their family members and on their wives. And we are thinking and working on how to better do that, in part by supplementing our use of presbytery records with Kirk session records, which actually sometimes have more of that personal detail. So that is one of those things that we'll talk about as forthcoming in a greater extent in the project. And Chris, I don't know if you want to elaborate on some of this. I just wanted to give a snapshot of some of that detail.
Yeah, so I can briefly talk about this just to show you those kind of levels of detail that you can go to. So you can see on the largest image at the top of the slide there, this is the 2 career moves of David Ogle. And you can see on that slider on the right-hand side of the image, in the search bar, you can actually search for those ministers who are the most mobile and those guys who are the least mobile. Spoiler alert, most of them are not particularly mobile in their career, but some of them make an enormous number of moves. Equally, you could look at where David Ogle went to university. He's a Glasgow graduate. But you can also go right into the detail of when he was so ill, it was affecting his job, because it would be mentioned in one of the presbytery records. So the image on the right-hand side at the centre there is the case of Ogle being ill at that moment. And as Mikki said, this is all built on these manuscript references at the bottom, where you can just copy and paste that whole reference, put that into Scotland's People, or when you go to the reading room and actually look at that material. So I don't think at any point Mikki and I have ever said that we can answer everybody's questions with MSR, but I think it's a great place to start your research, to say, okay, I've now got this anchor in the original material where I can go to that, and I know that at least between this point and this point, I'm potentially going to find references to this person that I'm interested in. So in addition to that kind of meta view that we talked about, those big numbers, you've also here got this incredible granularity to the level, the extent that you want to go to be able to start your search in the archive, or maybe to finish your search in your kind of family history journey, I suppose. So yeah, and David Ogle is one of the most boring examples that I could have picked, I think. But we were quite proud we picked up his illnesses, I think, out of manuscripts. That's very granular. But if you go on the website and you look at any of these, especially the journeys page, if you are navigating our website, if you go on the journeys page and you select to look at all of the parishes, you can see every movement of every minister in the data set over this century and a bit period. And it is incredible to look at that kind of level of mobility, people moving between East West Lothian, people kind of being attracted into Edinburgh because of its high stipends and kind of notable patrons. And then looking at where ministers were ill, when they were ill, and the key events happening in their lives. So you can go to whatever level of detail you need at whatever level of research you're at. So we can have the next slide, Joss, please.
And we'll just go quickly through this because I am mindful of the time and want to make sure we have time for question and answers. But as I've already alluded to, the next big step for Chris and I is to expand this project. As Chris said, we picked the Synod of Lothian and Tweeddale as sort of a proof of concept test case because it is such a large, important, and diverse region of Scotland. But of course, it only tells us a little bit of the story. And for us to really understand those patterns of regional and chronological change, for us to understand if there is a sort of blueprint for a typical clerical career, we need to have our work cover the whole of Scotland, and we need to dig deep into 900 additional events and 900 additional parishes. So it's and Chris will tell you what these numbers mean in just a second, but it's a very big project. Just as sort of a clear, for the sake of transparency, Chris and I are currently in the process of thinking about grant applications to fund the extension of this work. That is actually really what has consumed us over, I think, the past year. And any academics who are with us will know the sort of labor that goes into the grant writing process. But we are really hopeful that we will be able to get off the ground and expanding elsewhere. We've already started a lot of that legwork here in the near future.
Yes, so these numbers, these cryptic coloured labels here relate to, my heart sinks a little bit, what remains to be done. So this is an illustration of how many pages of presbytery manuscript material exist for each of these synod regions in Scotland. The red, I'm really pleased to say, is the presbyteries of Synod Lothian and Tweeddale. We supplemented that with Kirk session records to get past that 10,000 page mark. But you can see there's a very obvious geographical distribution or lack thereof of the extant material that survives. And what we wanted to do was go through these kind of multiple stages, carving up Scotland, I suppose. The green numbers being the second stage, the blue being the first stage that we'll move on to, and into the north of Scotland with a very small number of presbytery records in the third stage of as we move forward. All in all, with these numbers and the Kirk session records that we want to use just to add that kind of detail, we're talking around 50,000 pages of manuscript plus additional stuff from printed diaries and records from boroughs as well. Believe it or not, the boroughs are quite difficult to track those ministers, mainly because the presbytery records for most boroughs are not particularly great for the early periods. The final thing we want to do, and Mikki has touched upon this, is to expand kind of what we're doing. So we know from the proof of concept that we can track ministers, we know how we model the data, and we can talk about that with you a little bit more in a moment. But we're particularly interested in expanding knowledge of clerical families, in particular spouses, so we can really add more dimensions to their lives. And this is a group of people who are incredibly prominent in their parishes, but who are kind of woefully underrepresented in a lot of the work that we see on this. So all in all, there's 11 other regions that we need to expand to. We need to get over that total of 1,100 Scottish parish mark, 50,000 or so manuscript pages, and to expand our knowledge of this key group of the clerical family in this period. So there's a lot of work to do, but you can see from that proof of concept that we've been trying to do that we've identified the kind of footprints we need to follow as we move forward in this project in helping us understand the Scottish clergy in a little bit more detail.
I think we're ready for Q&A.
Yeah, I think that concludes everything. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.